In the audience who have lots to say and contribute. So, without further ado, Scott, the floor is yours. I'm going to send you down a microphone.
Right, thank you, Monica. So let me start off with a disclaimer, or maybe even an apologetic. I'm a natural scientist by training and inclination. I guess I have some nascent humanist leanings, but coming from the physical and natural sciences, I have a particular perspective on the notion of the democratization of risk and risk deliberation. And I guess that particular perspective is that although I'm generally positive about the notion of democratization, deliberative risk-based decision-making, I still firmly believe that there's a very strong role for what in other circles would be called subject matter experts in restricted areas, constrained areas, I might add. So let me just start off by talking a little bit about what I perceive to be these notions of risk democratization and risk deliberation. So if we're talking about risk deliberation, we're talking about some sort of a recursive, iterative process of exchange of information, of views and perspectives. And I think the idea here is that if we have some sort of process that looks like that, at the end we will have, in some sense, better decisions. What we mean by better decisions is a little unclear to me, but at least I think everybody would agree that at least we have decisions where the probability of people agreeing with those decisions is greater than in some sort of non-democratized, non-deliberative process. That does not mean, though, that we're going to continue this process indefinitely. In principle, an iterative, recursive process could proceed without end, but we do have constraints, logistical constraints on time, energy, patience. So at some stage the process has to stop and decisions have to be made. With respect to the notion of risk democratization, this is where the public engagement comes in. To me, it seems to imply a certain Catholicism about who is actually engaged, and I would take it as a starting premise that what we want to do is hear as many voices as we possibly can throughout the process, right from beginning to end, bearing in mind the constraints of time, energy, and patience. So that's where I'm starting from with respect to this issue of public engagement, risk democratization, and risk deliberation. So what are the implications to the risk-based decision-making process? Well, from my perspective, and I remember I referred to my previous opening remark about becoming from the natural sciences. For me, there are three components to that process. One is the kind of the analytical component of estimating risks. The second one is the critically important but often underplayed or under-examined process of determining risk tolerance and risk acceptability. And then the third one is, given risk estimation and given risk tolerances or acceptability, how ought risks to be managed and communicated. So with respect to the notion of risk estimation, what does a more democratized, deliberative process involving the public mean? What are the implications of it? Well, to my way of thinking, there are two such implications. The first one is that implies a much more open and transparent and prolonged or protracted process for identifying what in risk parlance would be referred to as assessment endpoints. These are the things that people value, the things, risks to which or benefits from about which they are concerned. And basically that means that through this type of a process, that whole collection of assessment endpoints, the values, becomes larger, and in my experience, way larger, which carries with it certain procedural and methodological implications. The second thing at the risk, and I'm talking about the risk estimation stage here, is that now we have a much broader set of sources of potential evidence to use in the decision, that could be used in the decision-making process. So we've gone from, in historical risk assessment and management, a relatively constrained set of evidence sources the expert sources largely, to a much broader set of sources. And that has implications, for example, to how that evidence is solicited, how it's communicated, and how it's integrated in the decision-making process. So those are the two implications at the risk estimation stage. Risk acceptability or tolerance, this is kind of a no-brainer. We have many more values, a larger set of assessment endpoints, so that what might be referred to as kind of the tolerable risk operating space becomes a much more high-dimensional and complex space. And that has real implications to things like how you trade off risks, competing risks in the decision-making process. The third element, risk management and communication, there are two elements, again, relating back to the greater diversity of values once we start to engage multiple actors or agents or institutions or stakeholders. We have this notion of this tolerable risk, this larger dimensional tolerable risk space, but more importantly now, when we come to assessing risk trade-offs and risk-benefit trade-offs, this space becomes very highly complex. And we get into my experience is we get into the point where, because of the complexity of the space, the whole process starts to congeal, because it's difficult, very difficult often, to wrap one's head around the complexity of the trade-offs associated with decision making, especially when you have a broad range of constituencies or actors or agents with differing values. So, what are the key tensions? First one, resource constraints, right? We have a much more complex process, way more actors, way more considerations, same timelines often, same resource constraints, often statutorily imposed. So therefore non-discretionary in principle. And that becomes the tension with resource constraints it was always there in risk assessment and risk management, it's just compounded dramatically. The second one, and this is a bit oxymoronic I think, is that even though we have more participants, more knowledge sources, more evidence streams, we actually have greater uncertainty, greater explicit uncertainty. And often what physical scientists and natural scientists did in the context of risk assessment was trying to reduce uncertainty by prosecuting their science in some way. Well, I'm rapidly coming to the conclusion that in this high-dimensional complex value space and tolerable risk space and risk trade-off space, that the value of trying to reduce uncertainty is actually quite small. And I think we're rapidly moving into an area where we just have to kind of embrace large uncertainty and take it as a given in decision making. And that has all sorts of implications to how one makes decisions. And then the third one, and this is one that I'm particularly interested in, is knowledge conflicts. If you have multiple evidence sources potentially providing evidence relevant to the same claims, knowledge complementarities or evidence complementarities, evidence compatibilities, no problem in the decision-making process. Conflicts, big problem. And so the question, when you're talking about knowledge conflicts from a diversity of evidence sources, now immediately you're into questions about how different sources are weighted, how they're valued, and this just makes the process much more complex than it was before. And that, to me, is my personal experience, is that tension is a really big operational tension. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Scott. You probably will expect that at some point we'll be asking you to provide some thoughts on how you resolve those tensions, so heads up. Keith.